Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday, the 8th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen former President Donald Trump charged with 34 counts of falsifying business records, Nicola Sturgeon's husband, Peter Murrell, arrested in connection with an investigation into SNP finances, and the death of former Chancellor Nigel Lawson at the age of 91. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is the boss man, Holden Frith, from daily podcast Today in History with the Retrospectors. It's Arian McNichol. And from BBC Sport, journalist Emma Smith. Go! Sorry, I know you don't work there anymore. I just like saying that. That's your AI programmed response to someone saying that.
Let's bring back the classics.
Yeah. Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A hostage to fortune or a fortune to hostage takers?
Today I'm formally issuing a new presidential policy directive to improve how we work to bring home American hostages and how we support their families. I've signed a new executive order to ensure our government is organized to do so. First, I'm updating our hostage policy. I'm making it clear that our top priority is the safe and rapid recovery of American hostages. And to do so, we will use all elements of our national power.
President Obama announcing some revisions to US hostage policy back in 2018. And now, Holden, we in the UK might be about to do something similar.
Yes, that's certainly what the Foreign Affairs Committee would like to happen. They published a report on Tuesday calling on the UK government to do at least what Barack Obama said he was going to do in that clip, which is to come up with a new and better way of dealing with hostage situations. But while Obama was talking after several years in which the main threat came from Islamic State or various offshoots of Al-Qaeda, the focus of the new UK report is what the committee calls state-level hostage taking, in which it's the government rather than a terrorist group that's holding a foreign citizen.
Okay, so are there some specific examples they had in mind?
Yeah, this was written specifically in response to the case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Ashuri, who were held in Iran for several years. But it is sadly topical again this week after 3 Britons were arrested by the Taliban and they are still in detention in Afghanistan. There's also recently been the case of an American reporter for the Wall Street Journal who was arrested in Russia and accused of spying. And this is often the way these sorts of cases go, where there's a sort of veneer of due process and the government involved accuses somebody of a crime which perhaps they didn't commit, or it could be that there's been a small infringement that then gets built into something much larger. And there's often the suggestion that the crime is somewhat connected with espionage, because that's both a serious charge and quite vague. And then they use the fact that they're holding these citizens and the leverage that gives them to try and extract some sort of concessions from the home country's government.
And Emma, what does the report recommend the UK does about it?
So the UK recommends a few updates. One of which particularly caught my eye was the idea that families should be more sort of heavily involved. And there was a phrase that was used in the report which was quite telling, which was that the report calls for families to be treated as partners who have the potential to be instrumental in the attempts to resolve the detentions rather than inconveniences. It also cites that, concluding that ministerial communication has been plagued by inconsistency and clumsiness. So it's basically effectively saying that the UK's approach has been often muddled and unhelpful for the families. It also talks about how families can feel as if they have to sort of act against advice and go to the press to or to their MP or to politicians to try and get help rather than through the UK government. And it basically makes a series of recommendations for the UK to effectively tighten up its approach, which it seems to indicate is not up to standard.
Yeah, that jumped out to me as well, Arian, because I guess on a human level, I suppose that's what you're thinking, isn't it? Reading a sort of seemingly dry report like this, you're not thinking, oh, what's the technical answer, a special envoy for hostage taking? You're thinking, well, how would I feel if this happened to me? How would I feel if I was Richard Zaghari Ratcliffe? And clearly until now, there's basically no one in the civil service who's like your point of contact. You're just left on your own to decide, should I talk to a parliamentarian? Should I go to the media? You don't get advice. You're kept at arm's length.
Yeah, I think that was a big problem that the committee was keen to point out. And, you know, they highlighted the fact that there was this, quote, considerable ministerial transience over the past few years, with 5 different foreign secretaries holding the post during the period of Zaghari Ratcliffe's detention. You know, this is a problem because there's no through line, and one of the things that they were directly advocating was the appointment of this new role, a director of arbitrary and complex detentions, and that role would be able to have a direct line through to the Prime Minister and also, you know, oversee this coming and going of, ministerial appointments, which, as we've seen in recent times, can be very swift indeed. But it was also interesting to me how pointed a lot of the criticism coming out of this committee was. You know, they really did point fingers at Boris Johnson in particular in the case of Zaghari Ratcliffe, and they effectively were saying, you know, we need to clamp down on ministerial clumsiness, they said, particularly looking at the moment when Boris Johnson had wrongly said that Zaghari Ratcliffe had been teaching journalism in Iran, which her husband told the committee was used in evidence against her at her trial and also used in Iranian propaganda. They also pointed the finger at then Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and her handling of another case of Murad Tabaz. And that was one where they were basically saying that she had done this thing that you know Emma was talking about, of being way too dismissive of families involved and not keeping them front and center in the conversations that were being had with, in this case, Iran, who were and still are holding this British-born environmentalist. And basically, at one point, she even said to them, according to the family's reports, Murad is now a US problem after the negotiations broke down. So, you know, not only were they being kept out of the conversation, but also they were being kind of kicked around and treated, at least according to the committee, you know, in a way that could definitely have been improved.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite embarrassing that, isn't it, for the Conservatives, Holden? Because, I mean, Boris Johnson, you know, has publicly admitted that he didn't behave in the best way around Zaghari Ratcliffe. He's never quite said that he contributed to the problem, but, you know, he's admitted that he could have dealt with that better. But Truss and Jeremy Hunt, who was Foreign Secretary and is now Chancellor, both of them, you know, went on to bigger positions, greater things, and talked about their involvement in this case as if they'd really been working hard and done great things and achieved great things. And this committee's basically saying, no, you balls that up.
Yeah, and it should be said that the chair of this committee is a Conservative MP, Alicia Kearns. So this does seem to go beyond party politics in the criticism and recommendations. And I think one of the things that comes out of the committee is the feeling that ministers, even civil servants, could quite happily say to families that we're doing all we can. And that's a line that's often stated. Because of the official policy of not negotiating with hostage takers, not wanting to make concessions, they can define all we can do as being very, very little. And so isn't really the expectation of a great deal of proactive negotiation or attempt to find ways through these sorts of hostage takings, which are admittedly often very complex. And there is a good reason why you wouldn't want to make concessions to either terrorist groups or rogue governments who have your citizens in their captivity. But it feels, certainly from what the committee's saying, that entirely understandable instinct can also be used as an excuse for just not really doing much and not facing any consequences for that.
Yeah, but I mean, leaving self-flagellation to one side, Emma, I mean, it's not the UK's fault that our citizens are being taken hostage. That is the fault of the countries that are taking them hostage. And I suppose one perspective would be, if you formalize and professionalize hostage negotiation and say this is how we do it when a state kidnaps one of our citizens, you run the risk of making it more legitimate and common.
It's one of those situations where you can't have an entirely strict set of rules like an ABC to sort of follow in terms of dealing with hostage takers, because each case is going to be different. If it's different nations involved, each will have different relationships with the UK. If it's individual the individual people who've taken the UK citizens hostage, well, they will each have different ways of negotiating, and of course, different hostages. They'll be in different situations. It's one of those things where obviously you can't have a very strict set of rules, but at the same time, you can have, at the very least, have sort of basic guidelines, things like the dealing with sort of the family, sort of like basic sort of understanding and training for how to sort of be more sensitive for this kind of thing, and sort of how to deal effectively with the media and sort of deal with sort of like the narrative that will happen around these events.
I think it's also important to make a distinction between the different types of hostage taking that exist. On the one hand, you have terrorist hostage takers, and on the other hand, what the report is particularly addressing here, which is state-based hostage takers. And the US and the UK both have a very firm line in the sand about not dealing with terrorists in hostage negotiations. But of course, when it's a state that has taken your citizens, all states, or the vast majority of states, have very complex, interwoven diplomatic connections with one another. And so talking to each other about the people that they have and what they want in exchange for those people cannot necessarily be put in that category of technical negotiation as you would have to say you were doing in the case of terrorists. Even then, with that hard and fast policy that both the UK and the US say they have, and about not negotiating with terrorists, I think there's a lot of murky, unspoken, backroom goings on that definitely happen here. And actually, for the book about persuasion that I started writing, and admittedly has been on the back burner lately, I spoke to a hostage negotiator called Sue Williams, who was the senior detective in charge of the kidnap and hostage crisis negotiation units at Scotland Yard. And she had been involved in advising the government in certain hostage situations. She's now a private hostage negotiator, but she was talking about the fact that, overwhelmingly, hostage negotiations get resolved, and quite often payments are made. This isn't public because, you don't want to be encouraging terrorists, exactly why the policy is in place. But there is a certain amount of leeway that's given to the people who are talking to one another, even in those cases where a terrorist has taken people. And I'm sure there's even greater leeway when it's a state that's done it, because you're just talking to your corresponding foreign secretary.
Yeah, so is there a risk that this will encourage states to take our citizens hostage, Holden?
I would say there is, actually. And the report is, to use a Johnsonian phrase, it does try to have its cake and eat it, in that it calls for a zero-tolerance approach in the first line of the introduction. But then it is also saying that Britain should have been much quicker in settling a 40-year-old debt with Iran of £400 million, which dated from an arms sale that was then cancelled when the Shah of Iran was overthrown in the Islamic Revolution. And for a long time, the UK was refusing to connect the release of the two prisoners with that debt payment. But in the end, it did agree to make that payment. It paid £400 million.
Which was entirely unconnected, of course, to the fact that the two hostages from Iran were released in the same week.
Entirely unrelated. But, I think this is an area where there has always been official clarity and then unofficial ambiguity. And even if, in the longer version of the speech that we heard a clip from Obama at the beginning, he played a very similar sort of, or towed a very similar sort of line where he, said the United States does not make concessions to hostage takers. And then he said a few sentences later, but I would also like to be utterly clear that we have never prosecuted any American citizen who has made private arrangements with hostage takers and paid ransoms. And other European governments have actually been much more willing to make payments, at least according to several well-documented reports. The New York Times said a few years ago that Austria, France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland all paid ransoms between 2004 and 2014 and secured the release of their citizens from various Islamic groups. And there was definite real-world negative consequences of that. The New York Times says that ransom payments were the main source of income for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which made about $125 million from hostage taking, mostly from those European governments. And that money was the principal reason for its growth during that period. The Guardian, actually, in a similar sort of report documenting this, said that one of the side effects of all of that government money flowing into the hands of kidnappers was it inflated the price that was being demanded for other captives. And so the sorts of private deals that had previously been made between relatives or often actually employers of people who are taken captives, they were no longer possible because the expectations were that there would be millions of dollars paid rather than perhaps tens of thousands, as had previously been the case.
Okay, so briefly then, would I be right in summarising that your view, Holden, is that we probably will see an equivalent to the US Special Envoy for hostage taking being appointed, but that also we will see more hostages being taken by states?
I'm more confident on the second point. I feel that this sort of state hostage taking is going to become more common, and I think particularly the sorts of relationship we now have with Russia and perhaps even China too, where the judicial system has been used as to sort of gain international leverage with academics and business people. I think that's almost inevitably going to happen.
But you're not confident about the envoy?
I don't know what I mean. It could be that is a measure that's taken because it is vague enough and it allows this policy of trying to seem to do something without being too close to actually negotiating directly could happen. But this is a committee calling on something to happen. The government has a long list of priorities. Whether this rises to the top, I'm less sure.
Okay, Arian, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Arian, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that as a society, Britain is becoming increasingly antisocial.
Let's say you have 1 hour of leisure after you've made dinner and had a long day at work. So during that 1 hour, you might receive 2 emails. You check one of these emails and respond to it. And then you might receive 4 Twitter notifications about useless bantering. Then you receive 3 Slack notifications, you answer one. You receive 1 alarm reminding you to call your mom about her birthday. Each event is mundane and takes only seconds. But now you've distracted your 1 hour of leisure into 21 discrete episodes or pieces of time confetti. It means that we enjoy our leisure time less.
Time Confetti, a video from BBC Work Life back in 2019 that amazingly managed to channel my inner monologue. Arian, what is Time Confetti and why is it in the news?
Right, so time confetti is central to this story, and it's the idea that our free time and our other forms of time are being fragmented into increasingly small and unsatisfying pieces. But what's happened this week is that a new study came out showing that as a nation, British people are spending less time seeing friends, eating out at restaurants, going out, exercising, and also volunteering than at any time since the 1970s.
Where did this information present itself?
So the study was assembled by a think tank called Onward, and they were looking at data that was collected by the Centre for Time Use Research. And that has been collecting information on how people use their time since 1974, when actually, interestingly, the BBC wanted to know when people were most available for TV and radio transmissions. And so they commissioned this survey to try and work it out so that they could have their best shows being aired to the most people. But that data collection has been done regularly ever since, and it's revealed all of these massive trends in how people in Britain who are actually aged 8 or above are spending their time. And curiously, what it does, this study does, is that it debunks quite a lot of the myths that we might have about what is causing our feelings, particularly of burnout at the moment, specifically that we're sleeping less and also that we're working more. But it is keen to say that what's going on here is that all the different kinds of time that we have to do things like paid work, housework, our own personal life admin, and then our free time are just being blurred together, this time confetti idea. And according to the study, that's what's leading to these personal problems in the form of burnout, and also broader social problems in our decreased willingness to engage in civic life, specifically in volunteering.
And how much of that, Emma, do you think is due to technology? I mean, that BBC video we just played in, albeit only a clip of it, did seem to point the finger quite squarely there at notifications, second screening, this idea that there's stuff going on online whilst you're trying to do something in the real world.
Yeah, I think it's the idea that we're now all supposed to be constantly available, whether that's, work emails or just being, sort of online. The idea that sort of like a person could take an hour sort of like just be entirely for themselves is something that seems quite antiquated. Almost sort of like the idea that sort of that you wouldn't be able to sort of reach a person for a couple of hours is it's something that's become much more unusual. And so, yeah, and if you have, like, say, an hour of leisure time, there would be distractions and things like that. And, there's this temptation to spend sort of like, if you have an hour to yourself, end up scrolling through your phone, sort of engaging, like as that clip said, on social media and stuff like that. And then it ends up sort of being distracted from whatever task you might have wanted to achieve in that.
There can be some positives with all of that, though, can't there, Holden? And dare I say, podcasting is an example of that. A lot of people listening to us right now will be doing so whilst they're doing a task that before podcasts existed, they would have found very boring. Walking the dog for the 10th time that day, or taking the kids to school in the car, or, waiting in line for a coffee. And we've given them something to think about. I mean, it can be useful having your time fragmented in this way for multiple uses.
Yeah, I think podcasts are a really good example of something that's made for multitasking. As long as what you're doing with them is something that doesn't require too much attention. Like if I'm doing the ironing and listening to a podcast, that is a wholly good thing that it in some ways actually enhances both activities. Because I think if I was just sitting doing nothing and listening to a podcast, I would feel restless, and I need something that feels I'm being productive in other ways. But I also sometimes find myself listening to podcasts while trying to check emails or looking through bits of information, and that I think is an example of the negative side of this sort of fragmentation of time, because that's something that I can't do either task well. I end up not really paying attention to emails, or getting really drawn into them, and then I've missed the bit of the podcast, or getting really my attention's taken by the podcast and I'm not really looking at emails. So I end up being very inefficient, but also feeling rushed. And it's entirely of my own creation. Like if I just did each thing separately, I would feel more rested. I'd feel more in control of what I do. But the sort of availability of information and availability of things to do adds to this sense of just not having enough time to do it all.
Yeah, I had that exact sense the other day when I was watching an episode of Succession, and I was completely engaged with it, or so I thought, until I found myself also scrolling through my phone, and I thought, what am I doing? Why am I trying to do this as well as that? And I think it's partly that, trying to do multiple leisure things at the same time that is problematic for our brains, according to this report. But more than that, I think it's saying that there's been this creep of work into our regular lives, that it's less the problem that we find things to do with our brains that are diverting while we're doing the ironing, and more that, this time that should be dedicated to putting your brain into neutral is spent thinking about the next email that you have to write, or the one that you've just read before you started ironing, or even, interrupting whatever you're doing so as to, which could be something that is social, like, spending time with friends or your kids, to deal with a work request. And I think that was part of what this report was suggesting, which is that we need to find ways to help people compartmentalize particularly their working life. Not necessarily, it was keen to say, by sort of packing work into a 4-day week rather than a 5-day week, but making sure that it doesn't, whatever leisure time we have, that work isn't allowed to drift into that. Now, how we go about that, I suppose, is quite complicated, because it means a whole lot of kind of personal changes as well as professional changes. But I think that that's the thing that this study is trying to address.
And we've had a bunch of conversations sort of similar to this, with overlapping themes to this, ever since the pandemic, really, Arian. But the thing that's different about this one, it strikes me, is there was the way the New Statesman covered this story, that exclusive access to this report last week, talking about whether politicians should do more to address time poverty. What do you think about that? That it might become part of the political conversation? Vote for me and we will address the issue of burnout.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. And you think about, well, specifically what the New Statesman was saying was that there's all this governmental interest in poverty of the financial kind, but there is this other problem that needs to be addressed, and that's time poverty. You think about a country like Sweden, which a couple of years back I remember had pioneered ways to encourage companies to reward their employees, not just with raises, but with more time off, so that, you could be incentivized by the idea of getting one extra day a week or a month to not go into the office at all and not have to work that day. And I think that, if you could put in place those sorts of strategies, that would be an interesting thing. I think the other thing that made this study unlike some of the other things that we've spoken about on this podcast was particularly the way that they tried to attach that sense of personal burnout caused by all of these factors to a sort of decreasing appetite for volunteering. And I think that, one of the things that the study said was that if people are too burnt out even to go to the pub or socialize with their friends, then it's no wonder that they're also incapable of going out and volunteering to help other people. That is borne out by the stats. I saw an interesting study by the National Lottery Community Fund, which found that basically since the beginning of last decade, the sort of 2010s, there's been this ever decreasing willingness for people to get involved in volunteering work. But conversely, they found this renewed appetite based on the sort of crunch of factors, particularly the cost of living crisis, that is causing people to have greater need. And even though, yes, people's willingness to volunteer has been falling in practice, fewer people are volunteering, their appetite for doing so has turned a corner in the last couple of years, and people are saying increasingly that they want to volunteer, I guess because they're seeing this greater need. So if we can align that intention with action, I think that could be quite powerful. But the question is, if people have no brain power to do it, thanks to exactly what we're talking about today, are they going to actually manage to follow through on their good intentions?
Okay, don't turn your phones off just yet. We have one more story with Emma after this. Okay, Emma, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is it time for a vaccine for squirrels?
People love to see these creatures. Tourists come here from all over the place, from abroad. They have an immense value. We've turned round the fortunes of this animal. We've got 1,000, and believe it or not, that's a conservation success. Because when we started on Anglesey, we only had 40. But they're under threat, a massive threat. Squirrel pox virus, which is a virus carried by the grey squirrel, doesn't harm it, but if it's spread to the reds, they die.
Craig Shuttleworth there, an ecologist at Bangor University, speaking to the BBC on Tuesday. So Emma, despite his Scottish accent, this is a story about Wales and squirrels there. What's the story?
Campaigners have warned that red squirrels could be wiped out by a deadly virus, squirrel pox, unless a vaccine is developed. 80% of red squirrels in one site in Wales were wiped out over the winter period by squirrel pox, and it's hugely affecting the population in other parts of the UK as well.
And it's spread by grey squirrels.
So it's carried by grey squirrels, which are an invasive species from North America. They carry the squirrel pox, but they are asymptomatic, and they pass on the pox to red squirrels, which can be affected by it. And as a result, red squirrels in the UK are an exceptionally endangered species. There are approximately around 290,000 left in the UK, which is a severely reduced number. In parts of North Wales, there are only around 1,000. For a creature which is one of the national animals of the UK, is obviously a very small number, is a problem.
But, I mean, they were telling us about this at school 30 years ago, weren't they, Holden? You know, the grey squirrel's coming for the red squirrel, watch out. I mean, it's still here because people are conserving the red squirrel in smaller numbers. The grey squirrel has obviously won. What's the point of intervening, really? It seems inevitable.
I, with some regret, would tend to agree with that, actually. I think it's sad that the red squirrel, it does seem doomed, but I think it is doomed, actually, in the UK and in Ireland. Everywhere that grey squirrels have been introduced, they have established themselves as the dominant variety very quickly. Most of mainland Europe doesn't have grey squirrels. The one exception to that is Italy. Italy's an interesting case because they have spread much more slowly there, but that seems to be because there were only very few introduced. In fact, there are some sources which claim all Italian grey squirrels are descended from one breeding pair released in 1948. It seems actually that's not quite true, but it seems only a handful of pairs of grey squirrels released in Italy. And that means that the populations they have there are severely inbred and actually quite weak, and much, much weaker than our fine, vigorous British grey squirrels, who descended from a much more concerted attempt to introduce them in the 19th century, because then they were seen as ornamental and exotic. And there are fears in Italy that when these sort of isolated populations eventually meet up, which they're bound to do sooner or later, they will then kind of interbreed and become much more vigorous and make their way across the Alps. So I would say if you want to preserve red squirrels, then Italy might be more of a chance of success if you can exterminate the grey squirrel population there. But it really does have to be an extermination if that's what you want to do. And I don't think we're going to be doing that in the UK anytime soon.
What do you make of this vaccine, Arian?
Yes, so the work on a vaccine was underway at Scotland's Moradun Institute until funding apparently dried up in about 2010. And Dr. Colin McGuinness, who led the original research program, said that basically there was still a lot of work to be done, including, more information gathering about how it would be delivered and also how much protection it offered, let alone all of the work that needed to be done to actually get the vaccine ready to introduced to the species in the first place. I think that there's a lot to consider here about whether that is money well spent, and it's worth considering the fact that, red squirrels practice many of the antisocial activities that we accuse greys of, specifically of stripping bark off trees, which causes problems, and lots of trees die because of, grey squirrels do it too, and also taking other animals' eggs and eating them. And that's a thing that both breeds of squirrels do. And that up until the 1930s, red squirrels were viewed as a pest and extensively culled. So, our attitude to them is partially based on this feeling of they're involved in the British national psyche in a way that makes us sentimental towards them. But, on the question of whether money spent on a vaccine would be money well spent, I saw this really interesting article in The Guardian that was saying that, if our goal is greater biodiversity, then our focus is wrong, because Britain spends between 400 and 500 million pounds per year on biodiversity projects, but only 600 million of that is earmarked for international work. This, despite the fact that the UK only contains a tiny proportion of the world's biodiversity, and in fact, in terms of diversity of species, the UK ranks 89th in the world. And so if we're really, really serious about conserving biodiversity, then there's better ways to spend the money. And this article, at least, was talking about the UK government's flagship Darwin initiative, which has been working to do exactly this. And they've done all sorts of international projects that have had huge success for comparatively little money. So I think we do need to ask ourselves how much of this expenditure is based purely on sentiment. And if it is sentiment alone that we're considering more than broader questions about the importance of biodiversity, then perhaps we should look elsewhere.
Okay, so that's the thematic analysis. Emma, I feel like we've reached the point in the episode where I can just ask you straight up, how would you vaccinate a squirrel?
With great difficulty. It's one of those things that seems like a well-intentioned idea, but which perhaps when you think about the details and in practice becomes very difficult. I mean, there have been some quite interesting sort of methods in terms of attempted red squirrel conservation previously, most of which have involved sort of attempting to control the grey squirrel population because there are no natural predators for the grey squirrel in the UK.
It's basically spiking a hazelnut, isn't it?
Yes, there was one very interesting piece which was about basically a hazelnut flavoured spread containing contraceptives was tried last summer aimed at grey squirrels, and it was like they were put into feeders which were activated by a certain weight because the grey squirrels are heavier than the red squirrels, so the grey squirrels would eat the contraceptive and then that would sort of control population. It was as sort of as bizarre as it sounds. And then there's been other sort of like attempts as well. There was one which I think was discussed on this podcast a couple of weeks ago about restaurants being encouraged to serve grey squirrels on menus. There have been so many, as you've mentioned, Ollie, this has been an ongoing thing for years, the attempts to sort of like save the red squirrel, but it's incredibly difficult work in practice.
Producer Sophie has constructed the following amazing list for me: hedgehog, water vole, beaver, Scottish wildcat, grey long-eared bat, hazel, dormouse. Of other endangered animals in Britain, Holden, do you have a favourite that you'd rather preserve than the red squirrel?
I'm surprised to find that we've all been relatively anti-red squirrel in our...
I'm a Letchworth boy. I'm a black squirrel boy.
I was expecting to be the bad cop of this debate, but no, I mean, I love red squirrels. I think they're beautiful, but I think, you know, this debate gets to the heart of the question of what we mean by conservation, because it's the kind of word that gets really widely used and widely agreed with, I think in part because it can mean very different things to different people. Some people it means keeping things as they are now. To others it means turning the clock back and trying to recreate something that doesn't exist anymore and perhaps never existed as we think it did. And sometimes, probably most of the time actually, if we're honest, it carries an aesthetic element, which is actually about making things pretty, even if that prettiness is much more of a human creation than a natural state, especially in England, I think, where ideas of conservation tend to include things like cottages and stone walls and sheep and gardens and all sorts of unnatural things. And the landscape here has been changed by humans so much that it's hard to conceive of what plants, what animals, which of those list of species would be thriving here if none of us had ever arrived.
Are you prepared to say beaver, Arian?
Beaver or hedgehog, I would say those are two that I'm in favour of.
Yeah, with that thought ringing in our ears and the desire to go and seek out some hazelnut flavoured contraceptive, my thanks to Arian, Holden and Emma for their stories this week. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, have a wonderful Easter. Bye-bye.